Catherine, Princess of Wales, made a private vow to King Charles III inside a shuttered drawing room at Windsor. And that vow, according to a documented private account, is the true reason the line of succession has quietly begun to move. The palace did not tremble because of illness. It trembled because of a promise. What was exchanged between the aging monarch and the future queen consort was not a plan for tomorrow, nor a schedule for next season, nor a rehearsed statement for the press. It was a sealed understanding, spoken barely above a whisper, that would decide who carries the weight of the crown when the crown can no longer carry itself. For weeks, aides had watched the king grow thinner, the princess grow quieter, and the corridors grow longer between meetings that once took minutes. Something had shifted, something had been decided, and no one outside that room was ever meant to know. Before we go deeper into what this really means, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The drawing room at Windsor was not chosen by accident. It was chosen because it had two doors, both of which could be locked, and one window that faced the garden where no lens could reach. The fire had been lit early that morning, not for warmth, but for the sound. A crackling hearth, in simple terms, is a screen against listening devices, a soft wall of noise that dulls the edges of speech. The king arrived first, wearing a dark suit without decoration, carrying a slim leather folder that had been prepared by no private secretary. Catherine arrived 7 minutes later, alone, without a lady-in-waiting, without a phone, without the small notebook she usually carried. That mattered because in royal choreography, the absence of a notebook is the presence of a secret. She sat opposite him, not beside him. She did not cross her legs. She did not smile. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The clock on the mantel, an 18th century piece that had watched 3 coronations, ticked louder than either of them breathed. And when the king finally opened the folder, he did not read from it. He slid it across the small mahogany table, turned it toward her, and waited. What she saw inside would not be spoken of again for weeks. For the king, the moment was not about power. It was about release. He had spent a lifetime waiting for a throne that arrived late, and now he was asking whether the throne could arrive early for someone else. His hands, thinner than the newspapers had shown, rested flat on the table because he did not trust them to be still. He was not afraid of dying. He was afraid of leaving unfinished what his mother had finished so completely. That mattered because a monarch who fears an incomplete legacy will move faster than a monarch who fears death, and the king had begun to move very fast indeed. For Catherine, the moment was not about ambition, it was about arithmetic. She had counted the years, the treatments, the appearances she had cancelled, and the appearances she had forced herself to make. She had watched her husband age 5 years in one, watched her children ask questions she could not yet answer, watched the institution she had married into begin to lean, almost imperceptibly, on her shoulders. She had not asked for this weight. She had simply not refused it. That mattered because, in the House of Windsor, silence in the face of duty has always been read as consent. For William, watching from a separate wing of the castle, the moment was not about jealousy. It was about fear. He had been raised to inherit, trained to wait, taught to smile when the cameras arrived and to disappear when they left. But he had never been taught what to do when his father asked his wife for a promise before asking him. He paced the length of a corridor lined with portraits of men who had all worn the same crown, and he wondered, for the first time in his adult life, whether the crown might be too heavy for a man alone. That mattered because a future king who doubts his own solitude will bind himself, quietly and permanently, to whoever stands beside him. For Camilla, the queen, the moment was not about position. It was about protection. She had been the woman the country had learned to accept, and she had spent every year since that acceptance building a wall of grace around the husband she had waited a lifetime to marry. Now she watched him walk toward a decision she could not accompany him into. And she felt, for the first time, the particular loneliness of a consort who cannot follow her sovereign into the last room. That mattered because the steadiest stabilizer in the family had just been left outside the door. To understand why this carried such force, the story must return to a dinner that took place many months earlier, in a private dining room at Sandringham, when no one yet knew that the king was ill and no one yet suspected that Catherine was. The table had been set for 6, but only 4 had come. The king had been in unusually good spirits, telling a story about a horse he had ridden as a boy, when he stopped mid-sentence and looked at Catherine with an expression his own children had rarely seen. He asked her, without preamble, whether she believed the monarchy would survive another generation. She did not answer immediately. She set down her fork. She looked at William, who was looking at his father, who was looking at her. And she said quietly that it would survive only if the next generation was willing to be honest about what it could no longer pretend to be. The king nodded once. He did not speak for the rest of the meal. But before the coffee arrived, he reached across the table and placed his hand briefly over hers. It was the kind of gesture that meant nothing in public and everything in private. That mattered because from that night forward, the king began to speak to Catherine differently, and the household began to notice. There had been other signs, small ones, easy to miss unless one knew where to look. A change in the seating chart at a state banquet, a shift in the order of names on an internal briefing, a request, according to a recorded internal note, that certain policy folders be sent to the Princess of Wales for review before they reached the prince. None of these were announcements. All of them were signals, and signals, in a monarchy, are the language spoken before language is used. The confrontation, when it came, did not happen in the drawing room. It happened 3 days later, in a smaller sitting room on the upper floor, when William asked his father directly what had been discussed. The king did not answer at once. He walked to the window. He looked out at the same garden that had been visible from the drawing room, though from a different angle, and he said, without turning around, that he had asked Catherine to make a promise. William asked what the promise was. The king said it was not his to share. William asked why. The king said because it was not a promise made to him. It was a promise made to the crown. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of every conversation the two men had never quite managed to have. William did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He simply asked, in a tone so quiet it barely carried across the room, whether his father had chosen his wife over his son. The king turned then. He looked at William with the particular tenderness of a father who has already grieved a version of his child he will never see again. And he said, with a steadiness that surprised them both, that he had not chosen between them. He had chosen for them. That was the moment William understood. The abdication, if it came, would not be a subtraction. It would be a rearrangement. In the days that followed, the machinery of the household began to move in ways that were visible only to those who knew what to watch for. A folder marked with the king's personal cipher, a small crowned monogram that indicated documents seen only by the sovereign, was quietly duplicated and a copy placed in the office of the Princess of Wales. A schedule of engagements for the coming season was redrafted, and Catherine's name appeared beside events that had traditionally belonged to the king alone. A box of ceremonial correspondence, the kind that arrives from Commonwealth realms and requires a hand-signed acknowledgement, was rerouted through a secondary desk. None of this was announced. All of it was noticed. An empty chair appeared at a Privy Council meeting, a chair that had always been the king's, and it remained empty for the full session while business continued around it. A card bearing the king's name was removed from a seating plan for an upcoming state dinner and replaced with a card bearing no name at all. A courtier, whose title cannot be given here, but whose function was to manage the flow of information between the sovereign and the heir, was reassigned to a different wing of the palace. That mattered because in the geography of a royal household, a reassignment is a resignation without the paperwork. The center was moving. The center was already, in some quiet sense, gone. And then came the second jolt. A medical bulletin, released without the usual coordination between the palace and the press office, indicated that the king's treatment would require a longer pause from public duties than had previously been suggested. The wording was careful. The implications were not. Within hours, editors across 3 continents had rewritten their front pages. Within a day, the phrase constitutional contingency, a technical term that in simple language means the quiet legal preparation for a change at the top, had appeared in a broadsheet that rarely used such language without cause. The palace did not deny it. The palace did not confirm it. The palace, in the manner of institutions that have survived 9 centuries, simply continued. But those who worked inside the walls knew that continuation was itself a kind of admission. The king was preparing to step back. The question was no longer whether. The question was how far. Late one evening, when the corridors had emptied and the staff had gone home, William and Catherine sat together in a small private room that had no official name and appeared on no floor plan. They were not the Prince and Princess of Wales in that moment. They were a husband and a wife who had been married long enough to speak in the shorthand of 2 people who had survived things together. He asked her what she had promised his father. She did not answer immediately. She looked at the fire, which had burned lower than either of them had noticed, and she said that she had promised to be the steady one. William asked what that meant. She said it meant that when the moment came, whenever it came, she would not let him carry it alone. She would not let him become the man his father had almost become. The man who waited so long for the crown that he no longer remembered why he had wanted it. She would walk beside him, not behind him, not in front of him, but beside him, in the particular way that only a wife who has already faced her own mortality can walk beside a husband who is about to face his father's. William did not speak for a long time. When he did, he said only her name. She reached across the small space between them and took his hand. That mattered because in the private grammar of a marriage, a hand taken in silence is a vow renewed without witnesses. Outside the palace, the country had begun to feel something it could not yet name. Crowds gathered at the gates of Buckingham Palace and Windsor, not in the numbers of a funeral, not in the numbers of a coronation, but in the steady, uncertain numbers of a people waiting for news they had not been told to expect. A woman in her 60s, wrapped in a coat too heavy for the season, stood at the railing and told a reporter that she had lived through 3 monarchs and had never felt a moment quite like this one. Her eyes were wet. She did not wipe them. She said simply that she hoped the young ones would be ready because the country was tired and it needed them to be ready. A broadcaster on the evening news, choosing his words with the care of a man who understood that his framing would be quoted for weeks, said that the nation was not witnessing an ending. It was witnessing a handover in slow motion. A front-page headline, printed in a font reserved for moments of constitutional weight, reads simply, "The Promise." No subheading, no explanation. The country understood. In cafes and pubs and living rooms and offices and school staff rooms and taxi ranks, the same conversation was being held in 1,000 slightly different forms. Some said it was too soon. Some said it was long overdue. Some said the king had earned his rest. Some said the princess had earned her place. But almost no one said nothing. The silence that had lived inside the palace had, in the way that silences do, escaped into the country. And the country was speaking about it in the low, careful voice of a people who knew they were living through something that would be written about long after they were gone. Inside the palace, the preparations continued. A team of constitutional advisors, whose names would never be printed, met in a room whose location would never be disclosed, to discuss the mechanics of a transition that had not yet been announced and might never be announced in the terms the public expected. Abdication, in the strict British sense, is a rare and heavy word, a word that carries the weight of 1936 and the ghost of a king who left for love. What was being discussed at Windsor was not that. It was something quieter, something more modern, something that had no single name because it had never quite happened before. A gradual stepping back, a slow handing over. A monarchy that did not break but bent, deliberately, toward the generation that would have to carry it next. Catherine, in the middle of all this, did what she had always done. She kept her schedule. She visited a hospice in the north of England, where she sat with a woman who was dying and held her hand for longer than the schedule allowed. She attended a small event for a children's charity, where she knelt to speak to a boy in a wheelchair and did not stand up until he had finished his sentence. She appeared at a service of remembrance, where she stood beside her husband and did not look at the cameras. Each of these appearances was, in its own way, a rehearsal. Not for a coronation, for a continuity. She was showing the country, without saying so, what the next chapter would look like, and the country was watching. The king, meanwhile, had begun to withdraw from the parts of the role that could be withdrawn from without ceremony. He signed fewer papers. He attended fewer meetings. He spent longer hours in the gardens he had loved since childhood, walking slowly along paths he had walked quickly for 70 years. A gardener who had known him for 4 decades said, in a documented private account, that the king had stopped that week to look at a particular oak tree for a very long time. He had not spoken. He had simply looked. The gardener, who understood the language of a man who had run out of words, had said nothing and moved on. That mattered because when a monarch begins to say goodbye to the trees, the goodbye to the throne is not far behind. There was a moment, one afternoon, when the king asked to see his grandchildren. Not formally, not with the household photographer present, just to see them. They were brought to him in the small sitting room where he took his afternoon tea. And he sat with them for nearly an hour, listening more than he spoke. He asked the eldest what he was reading. He asked the middle child about a drawing she had made. He asked the youngest a question so quiet that no one else in the room heard the answer. When they left, he watched them go from the window, and he did not turn away from the window for a long time. Catherine, who had brought them, waited in the doorway. When he finally turned, he looked at her and said only, "Thank you." She nodded. She did not need to say anything else. The promise had already been made. It was simply being kept. In the days that followed, a small delegation from the Commonwealth arrived at the palace for a meeting that had been on the calendar for months. The king attended the opening. He shook hands. He said the words that needed to be said. And then, in a move that surprised no one in the room but would surprise the country when it eventually learned of it, he asked the Princess of Wales to remain for the substantive discussions while he retired to rest. She stayed. She listened. She spoke when it was appropriate, with the quiet confidence of someone who had prepared for the moment without ever being told exactly when it would come. The delegates, professional readers of royal signals, understood what they were seeing. They did not say so aloud. They did not need to. They simply adjusted their notes and continued. That evening, William came to find her. He asked how it had gone. She said it had gone well. He asked if she was tired. She said she was. He sat beside her on the small sofa in their private sitting room, and he did not speak for a long time. When he did, he said that he had watched her from a distance that afternoon, and he had understood, perhaps for the first time, why his father had chosen to speak to her first. She asked what he meant. He said that she carried it without seeming to carry it, and that was the rarest kind of strength in a family that had always confused weight with worth. She looked at him. She did not smile. She simply reached for his hand again, where she had reached for it in the small room with the low fire, and she held it. That mattered because in a marriage that had survived illness, scandal, scrutiny, and silence, a hand held twice is a covenant. The rain came the next morning. It came softly at first, then heavily, the kind of English rain that seems to know it is being watched. Umbrellas appeared outside the palace gates. The crowds did not disperse. If anything, they grew. A young man, standing near the front of the crowd, told a passing camera that he had come because his grandmother had told him to come. She had said that history did not always announce itself, and that sometimes a person had to stand in the rain to be part of it. He was not sure, he said, what he was standing for, but he was sure it mattered. That mattered because in a country that had grown weary of certainty, the willingness to stand in the rain for something unnamed was the truest measure of what the monarchy still meant. Inside, the king signed a document. It was not the document the public would eventually see. It was a preliminary instrument, a legal preparation, a piece of paper that in simple terms was the first step in a staircase whose final step had not yet been named. He signed it with the same pen he had used at his own accession. A small detail that only his private secretary noticed and only his private secretary would remember. He handed the pen back. He did not keep it. That mattered because a monarch who does not keep the pen of his own succession is a monarch who has already begun to hand over the story. Catherine was in another room when the document was signed. She was reading a letter from her mother. A letter that had nothing to do with the crown and everything to do with being a daughter. She folded the letter carefully. She placed it in a small wooden box on her writing desk, a box she had kept since her wedding, a box that contained the private letters she could not bear to throw away. She closed the lid. She sat for a moment with her hand on the lid. That mattered because, in the middle of a constitutional shift that would be written about for generations, the future queen was, for one quiet minute, simply a woman closing a box her mother had touched. The public reaction, when the first careful hints of the transition began to reach the papers, was not the frenzy the palace had feared. It was something softer, something more complicated, something that felt less like a scandal, and more like a nation exhaling. Commentators who had spent decades sharpening their knives for exactly this kind of story found themselves writing sentences they had not expected to write. A columnist who had never been kind to the royal family wrote, in a piece that would be quoted for weeks, that the country had been given the rarest gift a monarchy could offer, which was the sight of a family choosing continuity over pride. Another writer, on the opposite end of the political spectrum, wrote that the transition, however it eventually unfolded, would be remembered less for what it changed than for how it was chosen. That mattered because when the sharpest voices in a country lower their volume, the country listens. Not everyone was moved. There were voices, and there would always be voices, who said that the monarchy itself was the problem, that no promise made in a private room could justify the institution it was made to preserve. Those voices were not silenced. They were, in the manner of a mature democracy, simply added to the conversation. The palace did not respond to them. The palace never did. But those inside the walls understood that the strength of what was happening depended, in part, on the willingness of the country to argue about it. A monarchy that could not be argued with was a monarchy that had already ended. This one could still be argued with. This one, therefore, could still continue. In a small church in a village that will not be named, a vicar who had known the king since boyhood offered a prayer on the following Sunday for the health of the sovereign and the strength of those who would follow him. He did not name Catherine. He did not need to. The congregation understood. When the service ended, an elderly woman approached the vicar and asked him, quietly, whether he thought the young princess was ready. The vicar considered the question for a long moment. He said that readiness was not the right word. He said that the right word was chosen. Some people, he said, were chosen by the moment, and the moment was choosing her now. The woman nodded. She walked out into the churchyard. She did not look back. Back at Windsor, the king sat alone in the drawing room where the promise had been made. The fire had been lit again. The mahogany table had been polished. The leather folder was gone. He looked at the empty chair where Catherine had sat, and he allowed himself, for the first time in many weeks, a small, private smile. It was not a smile of triumph. It was not a smile of relief. It was the smile of a man who had spent his whole life carrying something heavy, and had at last found the hands he could trust to carry it after him. He closed his eyes. He listened to the fire. He did not move for a long time. Elsewhere in the palace, Catherine stood at a window and watched the rain finally begin to ease. She was thinking of the promise. She was thinking of the king. She was thinking of her husband and her children and the country that was waiting outside the gates for a story it did not yet fully know. She had not asked for this. She had not refused it. She had simply, in the quiet way that had always been her particular gift, agreed to carry it. She placed her hand flat against the glass. The glass was cold. The rain was slowing. Somewhere in the distance, a bell began to ring, marking an hour that had already, in every way that mattered, passed. The king gave the country honesty. The princess gave it grace. The prince gave it steadiness. The queen gave it patience. And the promise, made in a small room behind two locked doors, gave the monarchy something it had not been able to give itself in a very long time, which was a future spoken in the voice of the present. What happens next will be written in headlines, in bulletins, in the careful language of constitutional lawyers, and the careless language of morning television. But the real story, the one that matters, has already happened. It happened in a drawing room. It happened in a silence. It happened in a promise. And now the country and the crown and the family that stands between them must simply learn to live inside the shape that promise has made. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next.